Yeah, I'm pumping out these videos, and this time it's the Nubia Z60 Ultra Leading version versus the Nubia Z60S Pro. Let's find out which of these two you should get. But honestly, to begin with, I kind of like both of them. So let's dive into the video and start with specifications for both of these devices, because there are quite a bit of similarities between the two. So let's quickly look at the specifications. We get a 6.7 inch AMOLED display with 120Hz refresh rate and 1200 nits peak brightness for the Z60S Pro, versus a 6.8 inch AMOLED display with 120Hz and 1500 nits peak brightness, and of course the front facing camera is under it. The Z60S Pro has a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, where the leading version has a tuned up Snapdragon 8 Gen 3. 256GB of memory up to 1TB for both of them UFS 4.0. 8GB of RAM up to 24GB for both of them as well. For the camera sensors, both have a 50MP sensor, which is a 35mm equivalent, and a 1/1.56 inch sensor size with an f-stop of 1.6. We get an 8MP telephoto sensor for the Z60S Pro with a small sensor of 1/4.4 inches, which is an 80mm equivalent, versus a periscope on the leading version with a 64MP resolution, 85mm equivalent, and a sensor size of 1/2 inches. For the ultra-wide, both have a 50MP resolution, but an f-stop of 2.0 for the Z60S Pro versus a 1.8 for the leading version, and a 1/2.88 inch sensor size for the Z60S Pro, where it is a 1/1.55 inch sensor size for the leading version. Both can record up to 8K with the main sensor and 30 frames, and both can record up to 4K in 124 frames per second with the main sensor. However, you can also do that on the supporting lenses for the leading versions, where with the Z60S Pro you cannot. In terms of battery, it's a 5100 mAh battery for the Z60S Pro and a 6000 mAh battery for the leading version, with 80W wired charging only for both of them as well. And of course that charger is included. Specs out of the way, let's showcase the camera performance on both of them. A bit extra from that, I must take a photograph with both of these Nubias. That's stunning. I'm gonna try at the waterfront as well. Certainly the sun is really low already. You know, I'm gonna get the opportunity to have that beautiful sky. Look at this. Disaster. Terrible weather. And then we have that view. Right now I'm just standing here because there's quite a bit of thunder, so I'm using 35mm equivalent. I have a bit more of the sky in the shot itself, because I'm just gonna hope to capture some thunder while it's doing that, and the shutter is crazy on this, as in the amount I can do, the longevity of it, which is really helpful. Just see that, hopefully it got it. Hopefully it got that one. So for the camera comparison, we are going to start with the main sensor for both, because both of these have the strength of a 35mm equivalent lens, and of course using the Sony IMX906. But of course there is a difference in CPU, so difference in processing. But because of that 35mm equivalence, I am using this sensor a lot more on both of these devices. I seriously do want phones to get a less wide sensor as the main sensor. I know a crop is a thing, but I don't want it to crop. I want it to be a 30 or 35mm equivalent as a main sensor, crop in on the ultra wide and replicate that 23 to 24mm equivalent. Either way, let's start with the results, starting at this old factory, where I felt like Nubia would do really well when it comes to that 35mm equivalent main sensor. So starting with this shot, the Nubia Z60 Ultra Leading version is a bit sharper out of the two. It has a nicer contrast. With the Nubia Z60S Pro, it feels a bit more like there's a white layer on top to brighten the shot up a little bit. Details are pretty similar between the two, and while I like both, the Nubia Z60 Ultra Leading version definitely has my preference. With this shot, it's actually the Nubia Z60S Pro that I prefer. A bit more contrast to the shot, where I didn't try to turn down the brightness just a bit to get that different feel. If you would turn down the brightness a bit on both of these, you would get a really similar result between these two, and I think both are pretty excellent, although the Nubia Z60S Pro, as stated, is a bit less bright, and therefore I like it a little bit better in this shot. And this is one that I really wanted to show because of how similar they are. Again, a difference in CPU, but same camera hardware. But in cases, the main sensor on both of them get a pretty similar result. And I love that. Both capture the shot so well with great details. Good feel, though in my preference I would turn down the brightness just a tad bit for a bit more of a moody feel, but a really similar result on both of these, and I think that's an excellent thing for both of these devices, especially if you just use a 35mm equivalent shot on either of these phones. In this shot, the result is very different though. You can see the difference in color, and it does change the feel of the shot a little bit. Both are nice, but in a different way. However, the Nubia Z60S Leading version was closer to reality. Now in this shot, the Nubia Z60S Pro went for a bit of a darker shot. Again, easily achievable to do the same on the Leading version, but both shots, if you get the same brightness, are pretty much the same. Heck, let me show you the result when I turn down the brightness itself on the Leading version, and you can see straight away that basically these two are again very similar, but by default it's the Nubia Leading version that will make the shot a little bit brighter. And it's basically the same comment that I have here. Very similar approach, slight difference in brightness, and a tad more sharpening going on the Nubia Z60S Pro. But apart from that, the approach is very similar. And we're back at no comments basically. They have a similar style, similar results, and seriously not much to say apart from some slight color differences between the two. You know what? Let me show you those similar shots at this Landschaftspark in Duisburg. This is in Germany, by the way, before we move on. So now we go to a different situation to showcase the difference between the two and showcase... Okay, very similar again, and that's something that you will see more and more when it comes to this 35mm equivalent. Okay, let's go somewhere else. Openluchtmuseum, starting with this shot. I love the contrast on both of them. A nice dark shadow, but a similar approach. But the Z60S Pro has a bit better control of the windmill, with the yellows being better visible, like it is in reality. And this other shot, again, it simply becomes impossible to really comment on the differences between the two. Yes, there are some small differences in terms of colors, but it's so minimal that I can't really make any comments between the two. If you shoot with the main sensor only, it's a safe bet to get the Nubia Z60S Pro over the Nubia Z60 Ultra Leading version, because simply put, you can save a bit of money while you use the main sensor only. And when it comes to the photography side on the Nubia Z60S Pro, it's solid and very comparable to the Leading version. There are only some small differences between the two, and yes, there are some cases where the Nubia Z60S Pro doesn't have as good as dynamic range, but that's very minimal, and it's hard to showcase that because you have to zoom in a lot on the pictures to showcase that. But of course, I understand the question that if this is so similar between the two, why would you even get the Nubia Z60 Ultra Leading version? Well, let me showcase it to you, because we will move to zooming into shots, and there you will see the difference using the telephoto and of course the periscope on both, showcasing what the differences are that are mostly related to the quality. And yes, video is affected on the Nubia Z60S Pro as well when it comes to that sensor, because it's an 8 megapixel resolution and therefore limited to 1080p. Starting with this first shot, yes, the Leading version has a yellow kind of hue to it that doesn't reflect reality, but in turn it just adds to the vibe of the shot so much, so I neglect that a little bit. It also has a much nicer contrast and clearly is the sharper image out of the two. But the bigger thing is the details. The Z60S Pro is a bit washed out and lacks details in comparison, of course, which is logical with the limitation of the hardware. And yes, this is the same building, but I wanted to showcase again with this 85mm that we have on the leading version versus 80mm on the Z60S Pro, that the difference is pretty consistent between these two kinds of shots while changing the position. And the same comments that I have before are still here. While I think that the Nubia Z60S Pro does a really respectable job for its sensor, and without zooming in you wouldn't really notice the big difference in quality, but it's definitely there. And just to make it a bit harder on both of them, with less than ideal lighting in this shot, details are nicer on the leading version. The Z60S Pro holds up pretty well until you start looking at the details. We get some chromatic aberrations, and the leading version is handling the backlight far better than on the Z60S Pro. But don't get me wrong, the Z60S Pro is still respectable as stated. If you would just look simply at the shot, I think that the Z60S Pro holds up well. It's a bit of a brighter image, but apart from that, it also captured that rust color a bit better than the leading version. So again, for the sensor that you get, it does a respectable job. But of course, in details, it still loses out, and again, it has a bit of chromatic aberration going on as well. Now in this shot, I think it shows probably the best of the lesser details that you would get on the Z60S Pro. Looking at the train rails, you can see the lack of details. Also on the overhang and the light pole itself, you can see a pretty big difference there. Again, I think that the Nubia Z60S Pro does well, but the leading version wins here, even if it has a small tad of oversharpening going on the trees itself on the left side. Now we are at my favorite place for photography, Openlichtmuseum or Open Air Museum in Arnhem. Easy to showcase different situations to highlight the differences between both of them in terms of approach. Here the leading version is a tad too bright for my liking, but again you can see the difference. The Nubia Z60S Pro has a bit more artificial sharpening going on in the shot itself to combat the lesser sensor, and while it does it well, you can see that the natural details are sticking out on the leading version, giving the shot a better quality and nicer details. Look at, for instance, the water itself. Overall, the Nubia Z60S Pro holds up pretty well when it comes to just the zoom capabilities of it. But against the Nubia Z60S Ultra Leading version, it doesn't really stand a chance. It's limited by the lesser hardware, which of course makes sense because you pay less for the phone itself. But the bigger part of it is down to video recording on the zoom lens. Just to showcase it quickly, it is limited to 1080p, where of course with the leading version you can record all resolutions with the zoom lens as well, in this case a periscope. Now a big downside for the telephoto is that we are dealing with an 8 megapixel sensor and you can only record 1080p and 30 frames per second. Video recording on that is just not good. The Nubia leading version, however, can record in 4K. But let's now move to, of course, the ultra wide and showcase the performance differences here for both as well. Now just to refresh your memory, we are dealing with an 18mm equivalent on the leading version, where we get a 13mm equivalent on the Z60S Pro. And of course the Z60S Pro does have a smaller sensor. Now from the get-go, the leading version looks more detailed and sharper in the shot. It captures the feel better as well, where on the Z60S Pro there's kind of a white layer effect on top of it, and it loses a bit of that proper color at the bottom. It looks like there's a green hue on top of it, and also a bit of softening going on there as well, quite a bit too much. Now that green effect also makes a return here on the Z60S Pro. Unsure what it is, but it wasn't like that, and it's only on rust layers, so it's peculiar, but it's something that I've noticed while shooting on, of course, the Z60S Pro. But looking at the leading version, here the shot is too bright, it's too much sharpening, so in these kinds of situations normally I would turn down the brightness, but I wanted to showcase how the phone approaches it by default. And that goes the same for this shot as well. The leading version does approach the shot a lot brighter than the Z60S Pro. Of course, it does have a larger sensor, so more light comes in. Turning down the brightness here would definitely be a beneficial thing for the shot to get that bright feel. And here I will say that the Z60S Pro did a really good job. It doesn't have that weird green effect, and in terms of look, it captured the shot and scene well. Now this shot is a really nice test because it's harsh lighting. It's quite dark where I was standing, but at the same moment we also have a bright light at the top, and I think both did decently well. Now of course when it comes to the Z60S Pro, it captured more of the shot, and that's down to preference. But in turn, when it comes to that Z60S Pro, there's some purple introduced at the corners. The leading version also has it, and of course both of them have a bit of noise going on and some discoloring when it comes to this leading version, where it feels like it has that top layer that I spoke about before, and that made it a little bit brighter. I hope that makes sense, but that's the kind of feel that I'm getting from this shot. Realistically, using both of these and the ultra wide, the Z60S Pro I cannot rely on as much. It can struggle a little bit with colors in some situations, and of course softening too much in parts of the shots, especially at the bottom. But in turn, with the leading version, you often need to turn down the brightness. While I think 18mm equivalent is nice for the ultra wide, 13mm is of course a lot wider in comparison, and that affects the composition, and here it's something that you have to choose. If you want that wider image, then of course go for the Z60S Pro. Either way, time for some comparison in terms of portrait mode as well. Now of course with the Nubia Z60S Pro it goes up to 80mm equivalent, where it goes up to 85mm equivalent on the leading version. And in this first shot using both of them as well. Now of course the guy is standing against the wall, so there's very little depth of field, but both shots look really solid, though I prefer the leading version, which has a nicer contrast and better control of the fire, where on the Z60S Pro you get a little bit of a glare under it. Also a nicer contrast on of course the leading version. With this bar shot I wanted to showcase how it would act with a subject instead of a person, and the leading version has a better depth of field than the Z60S Pro, finding it a bit harder to determine what is on the background and what is not in comparison. Now for both you have different styles that you can play around with. Sadly no black and white though, but my favorites are Japanese and nature. The shots coming from it I like in terms of style. Both though are a bit more soft in terms of style and feel. But both of them have a weakness. I cannot adjust the amount of bokeh after taking the shot. So if you take a shot of yourself or someone else and you just miss that point of focus, you cannot adjust it and you have to take the shot again. And that's a shame because you need to have that ability to adjust it just for those points where you don't have that effect, or if you want to adjust the bokeh up or down. Alright, so 4K 60 frames per second. Both the main sensors are 35mm equivalent. Of course the CPU is different inside, but the sensor is the same. You can however see quite a bit of difference. I have a little bit of an issue with the sky itself, not much, because it kind of looks like that, just a little bit overexposure. Contrast is nicer on the leading version compared to the Z60S Pro. Both cannot zoom out, so you cannot change the lens itself or go to different focal length. Of course both can zoom in, but this is all digital. And both can record up to 4K 120 frames per second with a limit of 15 minutes. Now what does this mean? I can slow down the footage, so I can make this for instance a bit more cinematic. Ultra wide on both. Oh, of course, the ultra wide on the Z60S Pro is wider than on the leading version. 13mm versus 18mm. Both on the main sensor are able to record 8K, 30 frames per second. Definitely looks smoother on the phone, far more color accurate. Z60S Pro definitely has some saturation issues where it's just too much. Both of these phones limited to 1080p 30 frames per second, but one is of course under the display and the other one isn't. However, it's still limited to 1080p And I could simply be because they didn't really want to eat on the leading version, of course. When it comes to the color on Z60S Pro, it's not great. Leading version has better colors, but of course we get this haze effect over it. But I think for an under the display camera, this is not too shabby. Let's look at the clouds. Oh boy, yeah. Then it becomes less. So yeah, selfie camera, this is the performance. Now we get to the last part, low light photography, and this is the first shot I would actually say using the main sensor that the Nubia Z60S Pro captured the scene better, even though it doesn't have enough blue light in the lights itself. The leading version simply has too much of it. It also makes the car blend more with the shot itself, where it stands out more on the Z60S Pro. And of course, when it comes to the Nubia, make sure you play around with their styles, because in low light they have some really nice unique styles. With this second shot, I think both did pretty solid, though both need a bit of work in the sky. It's a tad off in terms of darkness and it should be darker, but I think both shots are fine in terms of just the feel and the colors, with a very similar approach between the two. Now this train station in Arnhem doesn't have a lot of character, but it's beautifully engineered. But the biggest thing is it's a nice test to see how the contrast is, the textures and of course the dynamic range. And again, I think both did a really good job. Colors are pretty close to each other with a slight difference in the lights and the warmth of it, but it's very minimal. Really nice and a clean shot from both of them. And the same counts for this one. A very similar result with capturing the scene close to reality, but the leading version does have a bit better separation on some parts, but it's very minimal. And this shot is a very difficult one. It's much darker than it looks on both of these shots, and that makes it a very difficult shot combined with the light itself. And yes, the leading version did do a better job in the dynamic range segment here, with a bit more details being visible in the light itself, but it did go overboard a little bit with the warmth in the shot itself. Just a tad, but it is noticeable compared to of course the Z60S Pro that was a little bit too low. Both though captured the feel really well. And in general, I think looking between these two with the main sensor, they are very comparable, with a slight edge going to the leading version with better control of dynamic range for most of the shots. But for both, they did a really solid job in terms of low light performance and for the price that you are paying with this main sensor. So, how about the zoom lens for both? Well, in this first shot, I think both aren't great. They have a decent amount of noise to it, and the leading version doesn't have enough dark sky going on. But in turn, the Z60S Pro didn't capture the blue light properly, where it is simply a bit white compared to what it's supposed to be, blue. Now in this shot, I turned down the brightness for both a bit. But see how the Z60S Pro is the one that actually has the better dynamic range. The light reflections on top, but also the signs inside the train station have a better dynamic range on the Z60S Pro over the leading version, which is kind of a surprise. Now that's not something that you see every shot, definitely not, but it is something that I wanted to showcase, where I think that the Nubia Z60S Pro holds up well in terms of dynamic range depending on the scene itself. But it can also lose in comparison to the leading version. It just depends a little bit on the shot. Just like this one for instance, where of course there is a slight difference, but still the leading version did do a little bit of a better job. And as stated, make sure you play around with those styles, because you can get some really unique looking shots. Now of course, to highlight the difference in experience, you can get shots like this, where the leading version pulls ahead. This is a very difficult shot to get right for both of these phones, for any phone honestly, but you can see more details on the leading version, and the dynamic range is also a bit better compared to the Z60 Ultra. And you can also see quite a bit more noise on the Z60S Pro when you zoom into the shot, highlighting the difference in terms of sensor size and just the general approach of the shot. And in terms of general shot, I think it's done better on the leading version over the Z60S Pro, with less light issues going on as well. But if you don't zoom in or look at the small details, I think that the Z60S Pro holds up pretty well. In general, I think both are really capable for the price that you are paying, and I think that the Z60S Pro holds up really well in low light comparisons like these. But there are moments that you can tell it's a smaller sensor out of the two, with for instance the zoom lens. just to make sure I push both of them. This extreme low light condition. 4K 60 frames per second. Each one is closer. The Ultra actually has a green tint. The other doesn't. Well, do I really need to say anything? Say colors are better on reflected on the Ultra, but yeah, quality is not a comparison. Apart from that, both limited to 1080p though. So it comes to no surprise when I say that the Nubia Z60 Ultra Leading version has won this battle. Seriously put, there is a difference in supporting lenses. Yes, the main sensor is quite similar depending on the shot itself, and therefore I would say when you use the main sensor the most, which on these two phones I actually do more than using, for instance, the ultra wide. Yeah, definitely here I would say that both of them are very capable, and if you use the main sensor the most, then you know, I don't knock it when you get the Nubia Z60S Pro. But when you do use the supporting lenses and you don't need as wide of a wide angle, then I can understand why you would get something like the Nubia Z60S Pro. Because simply put, it's very capable, but it's not gonna beat the Nubia Z60 Ultra Leading version. Either way, let me know what you think about both of these. What do you think about the Nubia Z60S Pro in terms of performance? What do you think about the Nubia Z60S Ultra Leading version and the performance itself? Let me know in the comments below. And if you aren't subscribed yet, don't forget to subscribe, like the video and comment below. And talk to you guys in the next